got some other history within the state and around an industry. And so it looks like government affairs. You were doing a Cloud Peak Energy, huh? It was for a few years. It looks like. Well, not just a few. It was like 8 years almost, right? So,
probably the longest job I've ever had.
When I was looking through some of your information, I didn't know that you were the vice president of the Petroleum Association for a year.
Yep.
John Robitaille is our president of Wyoming now, and had been in the vice president's seat for quite some time.
Yeah, so we worked together at the same time.
All kinds of tidbits of information.
Oh yeah, it's a small world.
Oh, you guys did overlap.
We did. Yeah, there were two VPs, kind of the way their structures worked out. But yeah.
Okay.
We shared a wall, and
Well,
he took me fishing, and we
did he really? Did you get some good fish?
Oh yeah, when you're living up in Casper, you don't have to go too far to get.
My cousin lived in Casper for a while, and he talked about that too. The fishing was awesome. He was always wanting to do like a guiding type tour, up and down. It was the Platte up there, right?
Yeah.
And so I went up there and fished with him a few times. We had a good time. I never caught anything, but I didn't really care because I just like floating the rivers.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great.
So Wyoming Infrastructure Authority. Tell us a little bit about, I guess we'll just jump right into it. That wasn't a weird transition.
Nope.
But Wyoming Infrastructure Authority, what is it? What do you guys do?
Well, we're actually at kind of a weird, or not just weird, but interesting transition point right now. Because actually on July 1st, it becomes part of the new Wyoming Energy Authority.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
And so, kind of a little bit of history is about 20 years ago, the state, through the legislature, set up a couple of authorities. One is there's a Wyoming Pipeline Authority to deal with pipeline issues, an infrastructure authority, which is a little bit misleading, but it's really sort of energy and electricity.
And that's just being kind of like renewed, right? Because it was it, I don't know if disbanded is the right word, but it certainly wasn't being utilized to what we're talking about being now, or is it restructured? Or
yeah. Well, the Pipeline Authority had been around for quite a while.
Okay.
About 20 years ago, it was sort of renewed, reinvigorated.
Okay.
Around that same time, we had sort of Wyoming Energy Commission, which was really looking at different recommendations and things. One thing that they said is, similar to pipelines, there is a need for all sort of electrical or energy infrastructure within the state. So the idea was that Wyoming, we make our money by moving our energy commodities from point A to point B.
Sure.
And if private sector was not going to invest in it or couldn't invest in it, could we set up sort of a state mechanism to help finance those things by providing, bonds? Sometimes they just need some help with kind of navigating processes, both political, regulatory, those sort of things.
Sure.
And so the Infrastructure Authority was set up to really parallel what the Pipeline Authority was doing, just in that sort of utility energy space.
Sure.
As legislatures are, known to do, they sort of bolt on bits and pieces over the years, and they did that with the Infrastructure Authority by adding a lot of sort of like new generation technologies. Carbon tech certainly fits in that, as well as sort of like energy export facilities as well. So the authority expanded, over time. And then about 2 years ago, the legislature said, when you're talking about, say, carbon capture, for example, you might have a power plant that's providing the CO2, the technology that's capturing the CO2, a pipeline that's moving it to an oil field, and then some EOR. And so it probably makes a lot of sense to kind of bring everybody together.
Sure.
One hand, too, it's, good government, trying to find some efficiencies and streamline some things. And certainly that's a goal right now, where we look at where the state is. But, making sure that everything is sort of, rowing in the same direction. And so that was sort of the emphasis.
Well, yeah, everything, you get too many people broke up. Everybody gets in their lane too much, which is always a difficult thing. I worked in the bureaucracy for a little while too, and I was doing the county planning thing, and you really end up seeing how compartmentalized everybody can get. So there is some real utility, I think, in bringing everybody under the same umbrella.
And above and beyond just the two authorities sort of merging together, the new board now has input from, say, like the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, Casper, the Oil and Gas Commission, the Governor's Office, and the Business Council. And the idea is we need to make sure that everybody's talking to one another, and it's not that people weren't talking to each other it was just
sounds like you're trying not to.
It was just a little bit more at half. It's like you say, you sort of get in your lanes, and unfortunately, things can kind of get siloed.
Certainly can't be innovative under that.
Yeah, and worst case scenario, absolute worst case sscenario is you're duplicating what somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
And so it was just that I think the Energy Authority was looking at where we are at a state right now.
Yeah.
The things that we need to be doing, the types of projects that we could be doing, and just said, let's just sort of evolve this. And this is, the Energy Authority is what they, came up with.
Well, that's a great segue into maybe talking a little bit about some of the specific goals.
Sure.
So I'll kind of set this up by talking about. I was up at one of the Mineral Committee meetings last year, and I think you were there. I'm pretty sure you were there. I'm on us all of them.
Yeah, it seems like.
But at any rate, at this specific one that I remember, it was talking a lot about how doing carbon capture projects up in the Gillette area and using, and hopefully you can help me maybe iron some of this out and some of the people in the audience too. But there's an effort to shift some of the coal mining or the coal operations to carbon sequestration operations in simplest terms, and then utilize some of that carbon that's captured for several different functions, all of which the groups that you just mentioned are going to be involved in some way of navigating and directing and overseeing. So can you tell me a little bit about what that effort is and how it sort of came about? And I know a lot of people out there that are listening are environmentally conscious, but may not understand exactly how this can benefit and what that's all about.
Yeah, you bet. So, I think Governor Meade was very wise in sort of how he started talking about like carbon management. Let's just call it that.
Okay.
Because, the term climate change, global warming, all those things, it's
a hot button in the state of Wyoming.
That's exactly right. And it's those are politically charged terms.
Yeah.
And when people are sort of faced with politically charged terms, you sort of tend to retreat to your own corner and you get a little bit
put up your dukes or get silent. Yeah.
But when you talk about carbon management and technology, people tend to be more open to listening.
It's more of a neutral.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't like the environment?
Yeah.
I mean, when I worked for Cloud Peak Energy, probably the hardest day in the year to get off was the first day of hunting season.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's in the oil and gas industry and all these things.
Everybody wants out.
Yeah, I mean, people who work in the extractive industries, they love their outdoors.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not trying to do anything that
you don't love the outdoors, you might not want to be in Wyoming.
Exactly. So, you kind of came to the realization that consumers' tastes are changing and society is changing. You have these larger societal concerns over carbon emissions, and we're not going to talk about climate change. Is it or isn't it happening? I mean, that's a Pandora's box that does not tend.
Well, it seems like what ends up happening, and we're involved in this discussion too. And I'm going to ask you a couple things here after you get done talking about your carbon capture stuff. But that's what we're seeing too. Is that a lot of times people can't even agree on what the problem is, let alone the solution. Yeah. And so we end up just kind of talking in sometimes platitudes, sometimes in just generalities, and we never can really get to any one thing. So it's a difficult thing to really solve a problem talking about it in those terms. So that we're seeing the same thing.
Yeah. So we kind of said Governor Meade kind of started the conversation this way. Certainly has carried over with Governor Gordon and a lot of legislators saying if we want to see our core industries in Wyoming continue to provide those jobs, provide that tax base, the trickle down effects of all the contractors, everything like that, we need to get a handle on carbon emissions. I mean, it just, the consumer is always right, sort of mentality. And so, the state looked at, what can we do to actually move the needle forward on these things? And they've made their investment on sort of technology development and deployment.
Okay.
The whole nature of R&D is you're gonna have successes, you're gonna have failures.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you're especially in the energy realm, they could be big successes or big failures. And with the limited budget that the state has, I mean, you look at say Petronova, which is a commercial scale carbon capture project down in Texas. All in, that's $750 million. State of Wyoming isn't going to invest that kind of capital.
Right.
I mean, even a tenth of that would probably be a stretch. So what they looked at is, what can we do with the resources we're willing to commit, which is still tens of millions of dollars, that's actually going to help move the needle the most. And so you're seeing, the School of Energy Resources is a great example of sort of standing up an entity to do that laboratory work, that hard work, that sort of, gets into the field somewhat, but, really tees it up to take it to the next level. The Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute is looking, at geologic formations and characterizing what's underground and what can we get. And but when we looked at the large scale carbon capture off the back end of a coal-fired power plant type of a thing, what we realized is there was a lot of small scale research that's happening in universities and labs and things around the country, but it's being done at a few kilowatt scale.
Right.
It's benchtop.
Schools don't usually have a whole lot of funding either. That's kind of tough to come by.
But it all starts small. We're going to prove the chemistry, we're going to prove the physics, and then if it looks promising, we're going to build a bigger one and take it to the next level. But there really was that valley of death between these really good, promising ideas at that small scale versus what a utility would need to see in order to make this thing a reality. And there were some projects, some technologies that were getting to that next stage, but it was usually a company that had a very well established reputation with a utility or something like that. And at the end of the day, eventually you need to test that technology at a power plant under real world conditions. And if you're Joe inventor who came up with this really cool idea, are you calling up Black Hills Energy and saying, hey, do you mind if I cut a hole in your $500 million facility?
Right.
And they're like, wait, who are you?
What are you talking? Yeah.
So back in 2014, the state of Wyoming appropriated $15 million. We had to find at least $5 million from private sector partners, but to build a post-combustion research center at a power plant in Wyoming. And that is the Wyoming Integrated Test Center that is now at the Dry Fork Station, Basin Electric's facility outside of Gillette.
And you're working heavily with those.
Yeah.
There, I would assume that you're actually spending time there.
I do at times, I'm not an engineer,
right?
So
you almost said thankfully. Engineers are great tools and sometimes tough.
I love my engineers.
We love you.
I love engineers. Spend a lot of time around it, but they would probably say the same thing. Then they go, you have to deal with the politicians. So, my role is, Governor Meade placed the project under the Infrastructure Authority to take it to the next level. So, we had to develop business systems, design it, do everything. So there were a lot of engineers involved. But once it was constructed and we sort of moved now into more of this operational phase, we have some great people up in Gillette that, man the day-to-day. And, this last week they were setting up a project with a team out of UCLA and stuff. So
a lot of collaborative effort.
Yeah. And so, I was up there a lot, but I haven't been up there as much as I had been. And, certainly sort of the COVID situation.
It made it all weird. It's convenient in some ways. Actually. I mean, the truth is, it's a little. It brought some convenience to things, brought some difficulty too. But so there's a lot of effort going on to come up with technologies to sequester carbon out of the air, and put it into a chemical form, as I'm understanding. Right.
Yes.
Okay. And then, so what is it that? What are some of the things that we're talking about doing with that carbon? Once it's been sequestered, because obviously there's going to be opportunities and there's challenges that come with just, now you got it, what do you do with it?
Yeah, exactly like that. You have to capture at some point. When you look at a power plant, it's like the Dry Fork power plant. It's about 12.5% of what's going up the stack is CO2. So you got to pull that out, and that's the first technology challenge. And then like you said, what do you do with it? Probably one way that really economical in Wyoming and we've been doing for a long time is enhanced oil recovery. So you'll take that CO2, which is in a gaseous state. You compress it and compress it and compress it until it's in a supercritical liquid. You put it in a pipeline. you take it to an older oil field that still has a lot of residual oil because, you think about typical, up in Midwest, Edgerton, that area, they've been doing enhanced oil recovery for quite a while.
Okay.
But those old oil fields where you're just doing a vertical well, there's still 60-70% of the oil that's still in place.
There. I need to get it out.
You need to get it out. And so if you're able to say, inject that CO2 at one end of the field, it sort of pushes that oil. It also kind of dissolves the oil off out of the formation. It makes it a little bit more liquid. It helps flow at a little bit better pressure, but it sort of pushes that oil over to wells. That can pull it out. So you can see additional oil recovery out of oil fields. Another project that's happening in Wyoming, just like a half a mile away from the Dry Fork Station, is a partnership through the University of Wyoming and the Department of Energy. It's called Carbon Save.
Okay.
And what that is they're looking at deep geologic, sequestration, a permanent place to put it. So about a year ago, they drilled a 10,000-foot well, and they're going through, they took those core samples, really looking at the geology and what would be, the cap rocks and all those sort of things to say, based on what we know, we think we could push this much CO2 underground and it'll stay there forever.
Away. Interesting.
And, and even though it goes in the ground as a liquid, over time it mineralizes, and so you get to a certain point where it's just more rock. It's permanently there forever.
Like hardens or something.
Yeah, limestone.
That's interesting.
In essence, it's mineralized calcium carbonate, which is
interesting.
And don't ask me a lot of chemistry questions. That's also.
I did the chemistry thing for a while. I don't know that there were too many chemistry classes that I didn't take when I was over at UW. So, but it's long since forgotten.
Yeah.
I get the gist. You can say the words, and but chemical structures.
Yeah. So,
but well, that's really interesting. I mean, I know you probably are aware to some degree about what we're doing at Encore Green, and I'm curious. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about kind of fits right along with what we're saying, other than we're not talking about necessarily taking CO2 and injecting it or anything like that. And I know there's other opportunities with that CO2 as well, as the university is studying some of the things that maybe can be created from it or used.
Absolutely.
So there's a great opportunity there, and so with what we're doing at Encore Green is, and for you guys that are out there, and maybe this will be information for you too. But our whole goal is to take, so for every barrel of oil that comes out of the ground, anywhere from 4 to 7 barrels of water comes with it. And so you have to figure out, okay, what do we do with that water? Do we go put it in an injection well? Do we put it into a pond and let it evaporate off? Or do we clean it up to a certain standard and then we put it into a river or a stream, for example? Solution to pollution is dilution, apparently. And so are these 3 different mechanisms of getting rid of water, sustainable for the long haul? There's a lot of question about that, and if you can't figure out what to do with the water, you don't, your production, you're not going to continue to produce oil. So if we can take the water and we can clean that water up to a standard that would meet an application to the ground, for example, our arid west is what's described by many scientists and agriculture, people who study in agriculture, as a carbon vacuum. I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of regenerative agriculture techniques and things like that, but like 80 billion metric tons of carbon can be sequestered every year just in agriculture. And you mentioned technology. We've got like up in these coal plants, where basically we're talking about making man-made technology that can pull carbon out of the air, right?
Absolutely.
So we're just utilizing the technology that already exists. It's been there since the foundation of the world, which is of the earth, which is photosynthesis. And so in photosynthesis, for you guys back there, chemistry, if you aren't familiar, photosynthesis again is just where you're taking CO2 from the air in plants. They pull the CO2 into the plant and grow. They take the carbon and use that to grow the plant, and then release the oxygen back into the air to give us cleaner air and healthier plants and overall healthier soil. So in the state of Wyoming, if we can, which we have now, I don't know if you're familiar with some of the updated. It seems like last time we talked, we were explaining how we were working towards regulatory pathways and correct oversight for things. So in the state of Wyoming, we've actually the first state to create a regulatory pathway for that to happen, and we've actually got it for every county. You can get a county-wide permit now in any of these counties to be able to repurpose. What do we have, like 2 billion barrels, which is like 40 or 84 billion gallons of water that we had been throwing away. Probably about 10% of that we probably have been using back into industry. So and that's a generous number. So 90% of this water is just kind of being lost when we could be putting it to use here and actually sequestering carbon. Yeah. So I think we have a lot of like-mindedness, at least in what we're trying to accomplish. And as far as in agriculture, and just like you're saying, with using this man-made technology, it comes up with different opportunities for innovators to put that to use, that kind of thing. And obviously, when you're growing grass, you're increasing agriculture and that kind of thing. So that leads me to my next question, which is back in I think it was 2000, the earlier 2000s, maybe 2009. It's been a little while since I talked or looked at the document, but I know that at one time there was a committee that was put together to explore some type of carbon tax. Now, tax is not a word that we find very friendly. It's kind of like carbon sequestration, probably even worse. It might be worse. But in the state of Wyoming, but most of the time the energy industry particularly is kind of tried to steer in a specific direction with a stick. Legislators are often trying to do that. So if there's a way we can incentivize it and make it an opportunity that isn't necessarily driven by regulators, a free market opportunity is something that I know we would really like to try to pursue or try to organize and figure out how we could do. I don't know. I'm wondering if there's anything on from your legislative side or experience or what you're seeing is there something that's moving in a direction towards either a tax, which we don't like, or is it something that can incentivize or help drive this change in the way we're doing things?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. The word tax is a hard one, and I don't see any sort of carbon tax, in Wyoming, even, nobody credible is going to be talking about it, carbon tax. Yeah. On the federal level, it's interesting. I mean, that dynamic has changed. Back 2009, you're probably referring to, it was the Waxman-Markey bill that would have instituted a national carbon tax.
No, there was a state of Wyoming effort. Okay. And what they were doing was looking at trying to figure out a way that they could actually look at carbon sequestration in actually in rangeland. It's buried. But I found it. You guys but at any rate,
I don't see anything on the horizon there. But I totally agree with you that if you can find market incentives to drive technology adoption, that carrot. Yeah. Or that push. Yeah. As opposed to a regulatory, pull. We're gonna be a lot better off. And actually, just yesterday, I participated in a webinar with there's some from California, and certainly a lot of people who had a very different viewpoint than we did. Because they were sort of proud of the regulations and the benchmarks that they had set. Sure. Things like 100% renewable, and you're like, how can you get? I mean, it's a nice catchphrase. Yeah. But what do you do? On those days when, the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing. I mean, it's sort of, you look at things and, industry, they sort of, they look at things and they manage risk from a worst case scenario. Whereas it seems like a lot of policymakers and NGOs and certain things, they look at things from a best case scenario. Okay. Best case scenario, you probably could figure out a way to make 100% renewables or 80% renewables or something like that. Yeah. But what happens those worst case scenarios? Sure. What happens those odd times when you do get a snowstorm in Dallas? Right. That shuts everything down, and so it doesn't work. So I think any sort of resilient energy system needs to have fossil energy. It's it's dispatchable, it's storable, it's all those types of things. And so what do you do with that carbon stuff? And and that's why we're thinking, we talked a little bit about enhanced oil recovery. Didn't talk about or touched on a little bit, but like CO2 products.
Oh, okay.
You can mineralize that CO2, make sort of concrete products.
Oh, really?
It's got carbon in there.
Well, when I was up there at that meeting, I mean, the Enhanced Institute was there, I believe, and they were talking about some of the things that they had developed, and I have to confess that I didn't understand everything, but it was pretty amazing stuff, and I was actually pretty proud, man, because I thought, dude, here's what we got going on over at the University of Wyoming is doing like groundbreaking stuff, not just for our state, but for the world.
Yeah, exactly.
in this area, and so it's pretty cool, and
so like you start adding those things together, and I'll use enhanced oil recovery for as an example. So to do capture off of a coal plant or an ethanol plant or something like that, it might cost say $70 a ton. Well, if you just have to do that due to a regulatory thing, you're like, that's a huge sort of expense. Yeah. Well, last year Congress brought in it's called the 45Q tax credit, which means for every ton of CO2 that is sequestered or utilized in some fashion, you were able to get a tax credit. And for enhanced oil recovery, that maxes out at $35 a ton. Well, okay, that's $70 cost all of a sudden has been cut in half. Now it's $35. Well, each deal is different, but $35 a ton is about what the market rate is for CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. So if we can bring the cost of those captures down to say $50 a ton, so a company that is now looking at doing a big project, they go, well, we get $35 tax credit, we can sell it for $35 on the open market. All of a sudden we can realize a $20 per ton profit by capturing the CO2 and using it for EOR. So there, we've created a market incentive to do the right thing.
And I think that's actually one of our goals that we've been doing, because when I look at the 45Q, I don't see that the 45Q is allowing for people who went out in their agriculture and to sequester carbon in their fields to say, oh, well, that now can be used as a credit. And I'm still struggling to try to figure out where the disconnect is between, I'm still relatively new to the dynamic here between, you've got energy industry, you've got agriculture, you got the environmentalists and the regulators, right? And all four of those, they pretend like they want to work together most of the time. They put on a good face, but they just don't like each other. You know what I mean? It's just that the interests just seem to not be. And so in what we are creating in here is a way, what we've been trying to do is create a way that allows everybody to get a win-win out of it. And so, for example, if we were to be able to say, hey, look, Mr. Energy Guy, if you were to put your water to use, green grass always looks good to environmentalists.
Yes.
Right?
Well, ranchers too.
And ranchers too. Ranchers love it because, obviously, anybody who's a rancher out there knows you're really growing grass. You guys are grass farmers. You don't raise cows. You raise grass. And if you don't have the right grass, right? Yeah. And so if you can improve your soil health, and you can increase your. And by the way, even our farmers out there in regenerative agriculture, if we can figure out how to help people increase their soil sponge, for example. Then we and all their microbes in there, we can cut down on some of the pesticides and things that we're using in our typical agriculture operations. And so this has kind of a broad effect. I don't want to go into too much of that, but there's a broad scope effect on taking that direction. So what we are looking at doing is saying, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I'll throw it out there. Still in a little bit of development here, but if you could provide an opportunity for an oil and gas operator, for example, to make a donation towards a regenerative agriculture project or an agriculture project that may result in a tax receipt, then you would provide a pathway for somebody to be able to do that. That was a free market driven incentive rather than a regulatory stick. So that's, I think we're thinking we're thinking on it's interesting how we're trying to accomplish the exact same things, just in two separate aspects.
And I think part of the disconnect probably comes from speaking different languages. And we found that out, or to me it became a lot more evident as the IRS was writing the new 45Q guidance that was just released like 2 weeks ago. Because EPA is usually the technical jurisdiction for all things carbon. But for years, the oil and gas industry has been using carbon or CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, but they're governed and regulated by typically state-led oil and gas conservation commissions, and not the EPA. And so throughout all of this, and it's a challenge whether you're, you know, deep geologic sequestration, EOR, terrestrial egg sort of sequestration like you're talking about, carbon to products, is you somehow need to certify and validate what you're doing actually what you say you're doing.
Yeah, and you know, that's really interesting because if you look at the cap and trade protocols, for example, there are cap and trade protocols for doing what I'm talking about doing is you know, really mob grazing, changing some of the way you do your agriculture operations. But what I noticed when I started looking through those protocols was that a lot of them, and just the whole concept of the ideology in general that kind of brought about the whole cap and trade system was, as we mentioned before, and I really like that Governor Gordon has pointed out, and he's saying, look, we're an all energy solution state. I know I'm not in an Encore Green, we're kind of agnostic as far as what the world's energy supply ends up being. But I think we realize that oil and gas is not going to go away, even if it does shift as a major power supply in some respect, and you get a competitor that comes up, it's still not going away. And so we've still got to figure out how to be more environmentally efficient and to continue the production. So it's not like it's going to go away no matter what we end up with. And so it's a problem that we still have to address. But what I noticed is that the oil and gas industry was actually not just disincentivized from participation, but barred from participation. When I went and looked at like programs or cap and trade protocols that for grasslands management, for example, it said that if you were an oil and gas or if it facilitated the oil and gas production, then you did not qualify. You couldn't. You didn't fit. And so it's like, well, wait a minute. Why are we excluding such a huge opportunity to benefit the environment when it seemed counterproductive? And it all comes back to nobody even knows what we're solving here to a certain extent.
So I mean, there's a couple things that, you know, one is speaking in terms of, you know, the EPA is sort of the gold standard of meeting their requirements. One of the cool things about this new IRS guidance is, and Wyoming had a huge role in this sort of shift. And you know, throw a compliment out to, you know, it was led by Steve Carpenter at the Wyoming Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, and Kip Coddington over at the University of Wyoming were really involved in this. But it was providing an alternative mechanism to certify the CO2 outside of just the EPA standard. You know, and it's through the ISO organization, which is sort of actually ISO stands for International Standards Organization. So creating an ISO standard for CO2 sort of monitoring and capturing and those sort of things. And so perhaps using an ISO standard like that may be an avenue for those doing, you know, looking at terrestrial sort of capture and those types of things. So, you know, Wyoming, I think, has recognized that there's some disconnect within some of these regulations. I also think there's a huge political problem. And back in, earlier this year, I had a chance to testify before Congress on a House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing. And I was just kind of amazed that the hostility towards anything fossil. And I think that's what we might be finding, why oil and gas companies are excluded from certain programs when it just makes all the sense in the world. You know, but there are some who believe if you provide an out for them, an avenue for them to lower their carbon reduction, you're providing an avenue for them to exist.
Right, and that's really what that's. what we end up doing is kind of exposing, right? Where the interests really lie. Because with Encore Green, this was part of what started this whole podcast, was that we found ourselves between those four different, the energy, environmentalist, regulatory, is saying, okay, how can we bring these guys together to actually work toward a solution rather than just kind of butt heads in our own lane? And when we come in with a solution that says, hey, this actually takes into consideration your concerns and your interests. Not everybody gets everything they want, but this is a solution we can all work towards together. It really, you start to see who is anti fossil fuels versus somebody who's looking for a real solution.
Well, and then too, when you're building a coalition like that, understanding who really wants to find a solution.
Exactly.
I think there are certain environmental organizations that if you find a solution,
they want it.
I know
they're there.
You remove their reason to exist.
Yes, there are those. Yes,
right. I mean, trust me, there are some really good ones that are focused on the solution, but there are others that go, no, wait, what?
Well, and it's interesting because I had a discussion. I won't mention her name, but I had a discussion with one of these groups that you're talking about, and I brought up that very aspect, and I was at one of their meetings, and she got offended at it, and I didn't mean it to. But I was just talking about the nature of, again, we're just trying to talk about, we have to have an open discussion about where everybody's interests are. And what I was explaining was what you just said. And I think a lot of people in those organizations do think they're in wanting to do something good. What I think that they're missing is that their organization doesn't exist if there's not a problem. Mm-hmm. So if there's not a problem, there's no reason for donors to give you money to try to solve something. And really, they're not, like we've said, it oftentimes doesn't become a solution. The solution is how do I protect? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that there doesn't need to be somebody out there to have a protectionist voice or position, but that's not usually a solutions directed motivation.
Yeah, and so identifying those organizations that have the same goal in mind. Mm-hmm. The people who are like, all right, let's figure this out. And I know from our perspective, we have actually made some progress forward by being able to work with a few organizations. Yeah. For example, the Nature Conservancy in Wyoming has been very focused or solutions oriented. If you ask them, do they want to see big coal mines and fossil energy? They'd probably say, no. Yeah. But they're also pragmatic enough to realize that, at least for right now and for the foreseeable future, it's going to be a major part of the global energy systems. And so finding carbon capture technologies and solutions is with an organization called the Carbon Capture Coalition and others that is, it's kind of a unique conglomeration of industry and NGOs. And
there's the climate change, the Citizens Climate Lobby.
Yeah.
Have you heard of a group called ClearPath?
I have. Okay. Yeah, I know them as well.
Okay, very good. So I've been engaged with a couple of those guys, and they seem to be very much on that wavelength of ClearPath. So much, I'm still getting familiar with CCL, but it's, at least with ClearPath, very much on kind of Governor Gordon's position, which is all energy solutions, whatever's actually going to work. We're not anti anybody, and in more of that pragmatic. Approach.
And what complicates Wyoming a little bit is the state has built its tax structure and economy on the extractive industries. And people are like, you pick on wind, or Wyoming doesn't like wind, and all these things. And it's like, well,
we've never liked wind, dude.
Well, this time of year we wish it was windy, so we could.
You and I were the weird ones. We stayed here.
Yeah,
everybody else left.
But it's not so much that they don't like wind; it's just that the revenue generated off of it is so small compared to what you get from an oil field or coal mines and even jobs and those types of things. When you look at the number of people at a power plant versus a wind farm, or a solar farm or something like that, and and that's a bigger picture, our bigger problem, far above my pay grade. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, the current tax structure that Wyoming has set up is it realizes all of its income, or the vast majority of its income, from coal, oil, and gas. Yeah. And until that changes...
Well, you got coal, oil, gas, and then agriculture.
Yeah, well, property taxes.
Yeah. And so, but agriculture, and that's one thing, and I'm not, and it seems to get it seems to get lost in the discussion where energy is concerned. And I think that's missing a boat. I really think that the energy industry and the agriculture industry, and maybe it's just because I'm thinking about it from my perspective with water, but I really do think that those two could act as better partners to solution problem solvers than I think that they have than they have. And
I totally agree.
And so I guess, and maybe this is where we'll end it out or whatever, and maybe we'll pick up another conversation later. But where is it that you think that the disconnect is? I mean, when I look at it, I sometimes outside of those mineral meetings, and I'm thinking, this is it because coal is such a big revenue driver, or was for the state, that it's like we can't just watch that die, and go away. So it's like we got to try to figure out a way to save that. And agriculture is not necessarily on its last leg in the same that it's perceived with coal. So we put a lot of energy to making that work. Is that what you think might be happening, or is it? And how do we? Because I've gone around, man. I've talked with so many different people, and everybody is understanding why it would be really important to use water in agriculture, both for industry, for agriculture, for the environment. At the same time, you don't see a lot of people championing it, just to be frank with you.
Yeah, well, it's sort of probably one of the unintended consequences of our citizen legislature, where, they all have day jobs. They all, they're sort of, drinking from a fire hose constantly. And what I've discovered with this legislature is they're very receptive if somebody brings them an idea in a format that's actionable.
Okay.
If you just point out a problem, they're like, yeah, okay.
Well, the issue actually is really not like if I was to go to a legislator, I don't need the legislator to write me anything. I don't need a new law, right? So maybe this is part of the problem. But you don't see a lot of, and I'm not saying there's not any. We've had some help out of the governor's office and some interest in that kind of thing, but you don't see a lot of the louder voices, I guess, directing any type of interest towards that. If I talk with them one-on-one, we're like, oh, hey, this is awesome. I get it. And it's almost like we did too good of a job of trying to create a pathway that this can just be done with private industry without getting the government involved, that the voices that everybody's listening to have nothing to talk to because they don't, if I don't have anything to write in legislation, what are you talking to me for? But you guys are the ones, not you personally, but they're the ones who kind of have that microphone, but we don't necessarily see that championing.
No, that's fair. I think part of it is making sure that you're talking in their language, and a language that does resonate is dollars and cents.
Sure.
Another way to look at it is what companies are now doing with regards to sort of carbon and sustainability. Certain companies like Oxy. They're very focused on carbon reductions, and Oxy has a huge presence in Wyoming.
Sure.
And so maybe being able to present some of the solutions that you guys are advocating,
we do,
as ways that directly you're pulling their 10K and their SEC filings and their annual report and saying, this is what you said you're going to do. This is or saying what you want to do. This is what we can actually do.
What I've noticed is that a lot of them are nervous for the blowback. So if somebody's go out there and say, well, yeah, I've got a great environmental solution, I can show you from A to Z, and I can document it and make sure that so for you guys out there, what we did is we created a batching process. We know exactly where everything went. So it's totally traceable and transparent. But if you don't have, it's very difficult. And I'm not saying that we have the discussions with like Oxy and things like that, and with all the different major players. But if you don't have regulators who are there to help give at least to give that support or voice of support, then all these people are saying, hey, Seth, that's a really great idea, and I can see how this can really benefit me. But I'm a little nervous to make a shift because I don't see anybody who's saying, we back that idea. And so it just doesn't end up. It's difficult. It's a harder lift.
No, that's a really good point. And I know, it's a different sector, but it's kind of the same theory works. Is power plants say, we don't want to buy anything with a single digit serial number.
Uh-huh.
We want everybody else to work the kinks out. And I think that's probably what you're facing with is until somebody has actually got it permitted, regulated, know that they're not going to get sued, know what their long-term environmental liability.
Well, and that if they go and they take a risk that's actually going, well, I mean, you got the same thing there with carbon, right? And if you're going to convince a large coal company or something to say, hey, let's shift, instead of selling coal, let's pull carbon out of the air.
Yeah.
You've got to, in order for them to feel convinced in that and saying, well, yeah, I can see we can take this and we can go do this and this and this. But we need to know we have the support from the regulators, from the community, from everybody. And so it really is a lift that I know you guys are feeling. And we're just wanting a little love.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Anyways.
And what you guys are doing is great. And, it all plays a piece, and it is kind of amazing how intertwined everything is.
Sure. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
It's a little longer than I was thinking, but that's okay as long as we kept things going. So, Jason Beggar, really appreciate you coming in. Anybody who wants to find out more information on it, can they visit like one of your websites or something? Or
absolutely. The Wyoming Integrated Test Center is. You can just search it; it should pop right up. We've got some good stuff there. We've got social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, all that sort of stuff for Wyoming Energy Authority, the Integrated Test Center, those types of things. So those are really great. Those are probably the easiest things to follow. And just stay up to date on things.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
You
Appreciate you coming. We'll see you guys next time. Check us out on Crossroads 307 on the Facebook page and the YouTube channels. Link, subscribe, hit the bell on the YouTube, and we'll see you guys on the next episode. Thanks for joining us.